In Blanco County, Texas, a research team deployed a grid of trail cameras deep inside active hog territory and waited. What they recorded over the following 3 weeks did not just challenge the existing management model. It exposed a catastrophic institutional failure, one that had been funded by the same agencies that were supposed to be solving the problem. But to understand why that footage was so devastating, you first need to understand the scale of what those agencies were up against. Texas A&M had priced the destruction at $500 million a year. For Texas alone, shredded cropland, contaminated water sources, structural damage to infrastructure that most people never see. Nationally, the USDA estimated 6.9 million feral hogs across 35 states, expanding at a rate that made every eradication effort look like a rounding error. The federal response was proportional. Aerial gunning contracts, coordinated trap programs, a USDA-backed initiative that, over 2 decades, spent more than $500 million nationwide attempting to contain an animal that had been spreading across this continent since the 1500s. It did not work. By every measurable metric, the population continued to climb. That is the official story, and it is accurate as far as it goes. Wildlife agencies were not incompetent. They were applying the only logic available to them: remove as many animals as possible, as efficiently as possible, and hold the line. The science supported it. The funding followed. For years, that was the entire framework. Then, that research team started noticing something that did not fit. Not a new study, not a government report. A pattern on the ground, one that spread across multiple counties in Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma, where feral hog sounders of 30, 40 animals were not migrating, not being trapped, not appearing in hunter-harvest data. They were disappearing. Traps sat untouched. No carcasses. No evidence of coordinated removal. Wildlife agencies, when asked, had no explanation. That is why the cameras went in. And what they captured is the reason a lead researcher, the moment he reviewed the footage, ordered his entire team to step back from the site, not because of danger, but because what those cameras recorded was so unexpected and so valuable that a single trace of human scent could scare it off. This is the story of what they found, the evidence that transformed a wildlife conference and silenced state officials, and the disturbing possibility that for decades, we have been paying to lose a war that nature had already figured out how to win. But before we get to that footage, you need to understand exactly what those cameras were pointed at. The feral hog is not a natural animal, not in any ecological sense. What roams the American South today is the product of 5 centuries of accidental engineering, a hybrid that began when Spanish explorers released domestic pigs along the Gulf Coast in the 1500s, and accelerated when Eurasian wild boars were imported for sport hunting in the early 1900s and promptly escaped. What emerged from that collision was something wildlife biologists still struggle to categorize cleanly: half domestic pig, half Eurasian boar, and in practical terms, something more dangerous than either parent species alone. The domestic pig contributed reproductive capacity that borders on biological absurdity. A single sow can produce 2 litters per year. Each litter averages 6 piglets. Those piglets reach sexual maturity in 6 months. A single breeding pair, left undisturbed for 5 years, can theoretically produce a sounder of over 1,000 animals. That is not an estimate drawn from worst-case modeling. That is standard reproductive biology for the species. The Eurasian boar contributed everything else: thick, layered fat and cartilage across the shoulder, a natural shield that deflects poorly placed rifle shots, an acute sense of smell that outperforms most hunting dogs, behavioral adaptability so sophisticated that researchers have documented sounders altering their movement patterns within 48 hours of encountering a new trap design. These animals do not simply avoid danger. They learn it, communicate it, and route around it. The result is an animal that shrugs off bullets, dismantles traps, outsmarts snares, and breeds faster than any removal program can operate. Texas Parks and Wildlife has stated publicly that to simply hold the population flat, not reduce it, just stop it from growing, hunters and agencies would need to remove 70% of the total population every single year. 70%, just to break even. Think about that. Now think about what that means at scale, because the damage this animal inflicts is not just measured in livestock and crops. It goes deeper than that, and it compounds in ways that took researchers years to fully price. And it gets worse. The USDA's national damage estimate sits at $3 billion per year. That figure encompasses crop destruction, livestock losses, property damage, and environmental remediation costs across 35 states. It is the number most often cited in congressional testimony and agency budget requests, and it is almost certainly an undercount because it does not capture the secondary damage, the kind that does not show up in an insurance claim or a farm ledger. Feral hogs are rooters by biology. A single sounder working a cornfield overnight can destroy an entire growing season's worth of crop in a matter of hours, not because they consume everything, but because they uproot it. They do not graze. They excavate. What they do not eat, they ruin. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service has documented sounder activity, stripping topsoil at depths of up to 3 feet, destabilizing creek banks, collapsing irrigation infrastructure, and introducing E. coli and other pathogens into water sources through their waste. The Centers for Disease Control has flagged feral hog populations as a documented vector for at least 30 diseases transmissible to humans and livestock, including brucellosis, leptospirosis, and pseudorabies. In areas with dense hog populations, local cattle operations have been forced to quarantine entire herds after a single confirmed contact event. The environmental damage compounds in a way that pure dollar figures cannot fully convey. When hogs destroy riparian vegetation along creek banks, erosion accelerates. When erosion accelerates, sediment loads in waterways increase. When sediment loads increase, aquatic ecosystems degrade. One animal, behaving exactly as its biology demands, can set off a cascade of ecological consequences that takes decades and significant public expenditure to reverse. The government's response to all of this was, by any reasonable standard, aggressive. Aerial gunning operations coordinated across multiple states, corral trap programs subsidized at the federal level, research initiatives, public awareness campaigns, interagency task forces, the infrastructure of a serious, sustained eradication effort. It was like trying to stop a flood with a handheld sponge. Because for every animal removed, the reproductive math was already working against them, and somewhere in the field, a very different kind of solution had been quietly operating for years without a single budget line or government contract. The Blanco County cameras were about to prove it. 3 weeks after the cameras went in, the research team pulled the footage. What they expected to find was evidence of a rival sounder pushing into the territory, or possibly signs of disease, some explanation that fit within the existing framework of what kills feral hogs. What they found did not fit any framework they were working with. The footage showed coyotes, not one or two opportunists circling the edges of a sounder, packs, operating in coordinated sequences with a level of tactical organization that the lead researcher, upon reviewing the footage, described as unlike anything documented in existing coyote behavioral literature. Let that sink in for a second. The coyote is a 30-pound animal. The feral hog it was hunting weighed 300. By every conventional understanding of predator-prey dynamics, that interaction should not exist at a meaningful scale. Coyotes scavenge hog carcasses. They occasionally take a stray piglet. They do not dismantle sounders of 30 and 40 animals. Except that is precisely what the footage documented, and not as a random event, but as a repeatable, structured hunting behavior that the team would go on to observe across multiple sessions and multiple pack groupings. The footage revealed a specific approach, multiple animals working from different angles simultaneously, creating confusion and splitting the sounder's defensive formation, not chasing, directing. The distinction matters enormously because it is the difference between opportunistic predation and something that resembles coordinated strategy. Wildlife consultant Dr. Marcus Friedman, who reviewed the Blanco County footage as part of a broader regional study, was direct in his assessment. He stated that what the cameras recorded represented an evolved behavioral adaptation coyotes that had, over generations of contact with expanding hog populations, developed hunting protocols specifically engineered to exploit a weakness in hog group defense. A 30-pound predator had reverse-engineered the vulnerabilities of a 300-pound prey animal, and it had done it without a federal contract, without aerial support, and without a budget. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew, hit subscribe. This channel goes deep on stories like this, the ones that challenge the official narrative with actual evidence. Because what the footage also captured was something even more precise than the coordinated approach. It captured the exact moment the coyotes chose to strike. And that timing was not random. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. Every strike the cameras recorded happened within the same narrow window of time, not scattered across the night, not random. Consistently, repeatedly, in the hour bracketing first light, that transitional period between full dark and full dawn, when the landscape is still gray and the day has not yet committed to itself. The research team initially assumed this was coincidence. After reviewing weeks of footage across multiple camera positions, they stopped assuming that. To understand why that timing matters, you need to understand what a nursing sow goes through in the hours before dawn. Feral hogs are nocturnal foragers. A sow with a recent litter will spend the bulk of the night moving, rooting, and feeding burning energy at a rate that, by the approach of dawn, has pushed her into a state of genuine physiological exhaustion. Her cortisol levels are elevated, her responsiveness is degraded, and critically, her piglets, having nursed through the night, are in their deepest period of post-feeding sleep, clustered and still, in exactly the kind of tight grouping that makes them maximally vulnerable to a coordinated approach. The coyotes had identified this window with a precision that no human researcher had ever formally documented as a hunting strategy. They were not simply attacking when opportunity arose. They were waiting for a specific biological state in their prey, timing their approach to the moment when a 300-pound sow was operating at her lowest physical and neurological capacity, and her offspring were immobile and grouped. The footage showed the sequence with clinical clarity, flanking animals drawing the exhausted sow away from the piglet cluster, a second group moving on the piglets from the opposite direction during the seconds of displacement. The sow, too depleted to sustain a full defensive response, unable to cover the distance back in time. Not every strike succeeded, but the success rate, documented across the full camera grid, was sufficient to explain the disappearance data entirely. What the coyotes had discovered, through generations of contact and adaptation, was not just a hunting technique. It was a biological exploit, a gap in the hogs' otherwise formidable defenses that existed for less than 60 minutes every single day. Now, here is the biological proof that the establishment ignored. The trail camera footage was compelling, but footage, on its own, can be dismissed. A skeptic can argue unusual behavior, a local anomaly, a single pack with atypical habits. What the research needed, what would transform an extraordinary observation into a defensible scientific claim, was physical, measurable, reproducible evidence that this behavior was not confined to one county in Texas, that it was happening at scale, that it was a pattern, not a fluke. That evidence came from wildlife biologist Sarah Cunningham. Cunningham had spent the better part of a decade conducting scat analysis across predator populations in the southern United States, the kind of painstaking fieldwork that rarely generates headlines but forms the empirical backbone of everything that comes after. Her methodology was straightforward, and her results were not. Working from coyote scat samples collected across multiple counties in Texas, Georgia, and Oklahoma, Cunningham's team submitted specimens for DNA analysis to identify the genetic origin of biological material present in each sample. They were looking for evidence of what the coyotes had actually been consuming. What came back from the lab was unambiguous. 30% of the samples tested contained fresh piglet genetic material, not decomposed tissue, consistent with scavenging. Fresh, meaning recent kills, meaning active predation, at a frequency and geographic spread that could not be explained by opportunistic behavior alone. 3 states. Independent sample sets. The same biological signature appearing across all of them. Cunningham's analysis did not just confirm the Blanco County footage. It proved that what those cameras recorded was the visible surface of a behavior that had already embedded itself across an entire region. The coyotes were not adapting in one place. They had adapted, past tense. This was no longer an emerging behavior. It was an established one, widespread, consistent, and operating entirely below the threshold of institutional awareness. When a field biologist with a decade of documented predator research presents DNA confirmation of active piglet predation across 3 states, that is not a theory. That is physical evidence with a chain of custody. The establishment had no response to it, because they had not been looking for it. But here is the part of the story that nobody was paying attention to, because while Cunningham was confirming that nature had developed a solution, a separate government program was spending millions of dollars systematically destroying it. Across multiple southern states, county governments and state wildlife agencies had been running predator bounty programs for years. The logic was familiar and, in isolation, reasonable. Coyotes prey on livestock, ground-nesting birds, and domestic animals. Ranchers had been losing lambs and calves to coyote predation for generations. The political pressure to respond was real, and the response took the form of financial incentives: $75 per coyote, paid on presentation of proof of kill, funded in part by the same federal agricultural support infrastructure that was simultaneously spending hundreds of millions on feral hog control. Two separate programs, two separate budget lines, running in parallel, working in direct opposition to each other. Dr. Marcus Friedman, whose regional correlation study had already drawn attention in wildlife management circles, was the first to formally map what the population data showed when the bounty counties were isolated. In counties where active coyote culling programs had been running for 3 or more years, feral hog populations had not held steady. They had not declined. According to Friedman's analysis, they had tripled, not grown, not expanded modestly, tripled in the same time frame that Cunningham's DNA evidence confirmed coyotes were functioning as an active, meaningful check on piglet survival rates in areas where they were left undisturbed. The mechanism was straightforward once you saw it. Remove the coyotes, remove the dawn predation pressure, remove the one biological force targeting the hog population at its most vulnerable point. The piglet pipeline and the reproductive math takes over completely. A sow that loses 30% of her litter to predation produces a fundamentally different population trajectory than one that loses none. Multiply that difference across thousands of sounders, across dozens of counties, sustained over years, and the population curve does not just improve for the hogs, it accelerates. The government had paid to destroy its own solution, $75 at a time. If you made it this far, you already know this channel does not look away from the stories that matter. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Because when Dr. Friedman presented this correlation data at a state wildlife conference, the room went quiet in a way that participants described afterward as unlike anything they had experienced in a professional setting. One state official, according to a first-hand account, put his head in his hands. The answer had arrived fast. The question now was what anyone was actually going to do about it. There is a shape to what we have just examined, and it is worth holding still long enough to see it clearly. A 500-year-old invasive species. An animal engineered by accident to be nearly impossible to kill, reproducing faster than any removal program can operate, causing $3 billion in damage every year across 35 states. Decades of federal intervention, hundreds of millions of dollars in aerial gunning, trap programs, research initiatives, interagency task forces, a sustained, well-funded, institutionally serious effort to contain a biological catastrophe. And while all of that was happening, a coyote pack in Blanco County, Texas, had already solved the problem. Trail cameras documenting coordinated multi-directional hunting behavior. A 30-pound predator that had reverse-engineered the defensive vulnerabilities of a 300-pound prey animal. A dawn vulnerability window less than 60 minutes long that the coyotes had identified and were exploiting with repeatable precision. DNA confirmation across 3 states, proving this was not a local anomaly, but an established, widespread behavioral adaptation. Population data showing hog numbers tripling in counties where bounty programs had removed the one biological force applying meaningful pressure to the piglet pipeline. And a government that was simultaneously funding the hog removal effort and paying $75 per coyote to dismantle it. One program working against the other. For years. With taxpayer money, if Friedman's correlation data is accurate and the population figures are measurable and verifiable, then the most effective tool in the feral hog war was not a helicopter, not a corral trap, not a toxicant program. It was an animal we classified as a pest, put a price on its head, and spent decades systematically eliminating from the landscape. The question is no longer whether coyotes represent a meaningful check on feral hog populations. The evidence answers that. The question is how many other ecological balances we have been dismantling through programs designed with genuine good intentions and catastrophically incomplete information. How many other bounties? How many other predator removal efforts? How many other cases where the thing we were paying to destroy was quietly doing the work we were paying billions to accomplish through other means? That is not a question about feral hogs. That is a question about the fundamental assumptions embedded in how we manage the natural world. The belief that human intervention, sufficiently funded and technically sophisticated, can improve on systems that evolved over millions of years to regulate themselves. Sometimes it can. The evidence here suggests that sometimes, in ways we do not see until a research team deploys a camera grid in the right place at the right time, it cannot. What the Blanco County footage revealed was not just a coyote hunting strategy. It was a glimpse of an invisible mechanism, a biological infrastructure operating beneath the surface of the landscape, solving problems we had declared unsolvable, asking nothing in return, requiring only that we resist the instinct to destroy what we do not yet understand. What do you think took so long for wildlife agencies to connect the dots? Drop your answer in the comments below. And subscribe, because the next investigation examines a strikingly similar pattern playing out with a different predator, a different invasive species, and a different set of agencies that may be making the same mistake in real time. The solution was already there, we just kept shooting it.